So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining our webinar this afternoon, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody in the various parts of the world that we have today. Our title today is 5G and IP, Preparing for the Next Big Disruption. My name is Ed White. I'm Director of Patent Analytics here at Derwent, and I'm very excited to be joined by a great panel today. With us, we have Mika Antia, who is Head of Technical Analysis at the patent business at Nokia, and Paul Carpenter, who is Partner at consultancy QipWorks, and previously Head of Technology, IP Development and Standards at BlackBerry. We also trailed the inclusion of Sam Zellner from AT&T on our panel discussion today, but unfortunately Sam wasn't able to join us. However, in Mika and Paul, we have exceptional knowledge of the telecommunications industry, with between them decades of experience in the special form of patent licensing that much of mobile communications rests upon. Over the summer, here at Derwent, we've been diving into the topic of 5G from several different angles. In July, we presented a pop-up webinar of an analysis of the 5G patent landscape. And one of the major findings of that landscape was that 5G is very different from what has come before in 3G and 4G. Essentially, a whole new mobile communications infrastructure incorporating new technologies. That technology, obviously, we know provides higher speeds for us as consumers than we've ever seen before. But importantly, also adds much greater capacity in terms of the number of devices that can be supported per cell into the millions. It also incorporates approaches that tailor and vary and swap connection speed for reliability of signal. What that means is that 5G essentially is the backbone for any device that beneficially can provide or benefits from data, even if very small, even if very numerous. In other words, the Internet of Things. In a few more words, 5G represents a lot of potential disruption. While for the consumer, access to 5G is obviously provided by having a new smartphone in their hand. But for corporations, for innovators, for government agencies, for those wanting to interact with 5G technology in the things that they sell, access to 5G technology will come through licensing, and specifically in many cases, patent licensing. And that is where our discussion will focus today. So starting off our discussion today, Paul, I'd like to come to you first to give us a bit of an overview into patent licensing generally in mobile telecoms. I think it would be good for everybody on the call, everybody on our webinar today, to get an overview of how it works historically, how does it work, and what's different about telecoms licensing.
Thank you very much, Ed. I think the thing that makes patent licensing in the telecom space significantly different is the prevalence of standard essential patents, which is a term that many people on the call will know, but for those that don't, those are patents you will necessarily infringe when you implement the standard. And over the years, from the development of 2G through to 3G, 4G, and now 5G, we've seen an enormous increase in interest around SEPs, the licensing practices associated with them, and the sheer complexity of the technology that embeds them, and therefore more patents. And the way that that has generally been approached in the industry is that there has been extensive cross-licensing. Companies with their own portfolios of set patents have met, been able to agree commercially acceptable deals to the two of them, and it's happened on a bilateral basis. And what we have seen as new entrants have come into the telecom space is they've realized fairly early that in order to be in a position to negotiate suitable cross-licenses, to manage the costs within their business, they've needed to either acquire or develop their own portfolios. And I've had personal experience of having been on both sides of that equation, both as a licensee with very few standard essential patents with which to negotiate with, and having been on the other side of the equation of having a very substantial portfolio of standard essential patents. And the lessons of that and how that has changed over the last few years is that really now licensees have become much more aware that they need to ask the licensor to evidence the strength of their patent portfolio. There has been a great shift in the recognition that licensors must go in prepared, must be prepared to show how their patents are directly relevant to the standards and the products that incorporate those standards. And the overall process by which that negotiation happens has also been heavily influenced by litigation, with a number of landmark decisions in various courts, including the European Court of Justice, on how you approach that negotiation, how long it is reasonable to wait before making a counteroffer, and a number of more recent decisions about what that rate is likely to be that you should agree for a license to standard essential patents of a given standard. Does that make a good introduction, Ed?
It does. So to sort of summarize that, Paul, and disagree with me here if I get this wrong, but to summarize that, this is essentially patent licensing as people in other industries would be familiar with, but in a very structured environment and for a very special reason, which is that devices need to be able to speak to each other. Therefore, there needs to be standards and protocols in place so that they can do so. And technology that backs that up means that people necessarily have to infringe. And the court system has essentially enforced a structure to that makes it fair and reasonable, and people know what they're doing. Is that a fair way of summing it up?
Very much so. And I think one of the great merits of the standards essential licensing programs are that from a licensor's point of view, you only have to do your analysis once. You have demonstrated that your patents are incorporated into the standard and necessarily infringed. You don't have to do reverse engineering. You don't have to go individually to each company's products for the things which are core to the standard that you know that they have necessarily implemented to be interoperable. And from a licensee's point of view, you have the opportunity to see very clearly laid out when the licensor provides those claim charts and the detail of that infringement, how your use of the standard relates directly to the patent. So in that negotiation at a technical level, there's the opportunity for a lot of clarity.
Okay, I think that's a good grounding in where we've been. What I'd like to do is move the discussion on to what's going to happen next, or what's happening actually right now. We've spoken about in our previous sessions in 5G that one of the defining features of 5G, and this is going to come across in our licensing sort of ecosystem, is its complexity. And in particular, when we talk about the millions of devices that are going to be supported per cell, the fact that the connection speeds can be very low but very highly reliable, or very fast and maybe less reliable, and it's enabling of this whole Internet of Things, all of this connected devices paradigm, that equals complexity. And in particular, essentially the market for mobile communication licensing is going to be bigger. It's going to be substantially expanded, both on the demand side, obviously, which is what we're talking about with lots of different people leaning on 5G technology, but also on the supply side. Mika, coming to you now, can I get your thoughts on that? What is different in your view in terms of 5G?
Thanks, Ed. Well, it's complicated now, but it's been always complicated.
Fair enough.
When GSM started to emerge, we thought it's extremely complicated licensing scheme, since we were not used to license patents on standardized technologies, but we were able to manage that. Then on 3G, the standard was initially blocked by Qualcomm, and there was a short period of litigations between Ericsson and Qualcomm. Once that was settled, standard was then continued to develop, and 3G was considered to be really complicated. But we managed, or 3G managed even though the licensing scheme was complicated. With 4G, there was a lot more new players, Chinese and Koreans in standardization. Again, more complicated scheme. And in 5G, a lot more companies, a lot more, say, new businesses. It's going to be complicated, but I'm sure it's going to be solved as well.
It's going to be solved, yeah. That's going to be clear one way or the other. I mean, Paul, from your perspective, at a really simple level, is there a wider supply of essential patents in 5G than there was in previous standards?
Yes, and I think we should remember when we talk about the 5G landscape that this is early. I mean, the work that Derwent have done and shared in the pop-up seminar, which you mentioned earlier, it showed that a large number of the patents that people have put forward as standards essential patents are patents that had previously been declared to earlier standards. Right. So those are the technologies which are being reincorporated as we move from 4G to 5G. There's a long tail of patents that are working their way through prosecution now in the new technology areas, which are fundamentally different in 5G from the generations that went before. And that portfolio of patents, some of it hasn't been published yet. Some of it has been published, but not yet declared. Some of it is in prosecution. We don't know where the patent offices will let those claims grant and when. So there's a big tail coming when we look at that complexity. And I think that with each generation shift that we had, as Mika just mentioned, with 3G we had CDMA, and that brought new licensors to the table that weren't previously involved in GSM licensing. In 4G, a lot of licensors with OFDM technology, which had been widely used in other industries before it was applied to cellular, came to the table with their patent portfolios. And at the same time, we've seen big exits from companies. I mean, the companies that were involved in the development of the 3G standard, I think, are all largely owned by Nokia now. And there's been a consolidation on the infrastructure side of those companies. And we've seen companies like Nortel exit completely, and then what happened with their patent portfolio. And we've seen more recently something which Ed will mention later with Intel exiting the modem space and what happens with their patent portfolio now. So we're having these technological changes, but at the same time, we're seeing these portfolios move around between the licensors as well as new licensors coming to the table.
Right. So it is that the supply side is bigger. We know that the demand side for the number of licensees is going to get bigger. But are those the only avenues of complexity here, Paul, compared to 3G, 4G? What do we really mean by complexity? What are the other sort of vectors of that? Is it just that it's larger, or is it more than that? Is there geography involved? Is it, we're seeing a lot of complexity around the actual usage of these telecommunication networks and where they end up?
Yeah, it's quite interesting when we talk about the complexity of the standard, because 20 years ago in the late 90s, I can remember many a presentation talking about how 3G technology was going to be ubiquitous and connect all of our pets to all of our homes, to all of our people. Right. And some 20 years later, we appear to be there. Actually, at that point now, with the technology coming that is genuinely supposed to do these things. So it doesn't always come as quickly as we think that it will. But in terms of the licensing area, one important change that's happened with geography, in 2G and 3G, we had competing standards in different regions of the world. And since 4G, we've not had that. There is, for cellular connectivity, there has been one dominant standard with LTE, and we expect that to continue with 5G. There are some low power technologies which have got widespread adoption for some of the IoT applications. But in terms of widespread operated managed networks, we're seeing a real dominance of single standards now. I think the users of the technology are also changing as well. I mean, we have seen such dominance of all of this technology being geared towards smartphones, and smartphones have, largely become commoditized. We're seeing simple low-end devices available at extremely cheap prices. We're seeing move from where there were many operating systems in the market to a small number of operating systems. And that consolidation in that market, is still driving something like $1.4 billion in sales last year. And then people start looking at the new end markets and, for example, offering automotive. And, I think to say to the patent holders, the idea that automotive is going to be your next big cash cow is a very naive position. I believe sales of cars in 2018 was something like 86 million compared to 1.4 billion for smartphones. So I think we need to look beyond that. Connected home may or may not be a 5G play, but when you start looking at other applications like agriculture, asset tracking, environmental monitoring, they can be really significant because they require masses and masses of devices.
Well, yeah. So I want to get into that, and one of the points that sort of occurs to me, Paul, immediately when you start talking about different market sizes in comparing the number of cars sold to the number of phones sold, for example, probably speaks to something that we want to get to in a moment around different business models than maybe have traditionally been in play. But Mikko, I want to get your thoughts on these new licensees. Paul mentioned a few of them in terms of industry out there. These are potentially entities, companies that have never licensed a telecommunication patent before. They've never licensed a standard essential patent before, but they're very likely to do so in a 5G world. Can you give us a flavor of who these entities are? What type of company, what type of institutional organization are they? And what industries are coming now, and what industries do you expect later?
Well, I mean, 5G technology, in addition to providing higher speeds to smartphones, has two other technology areas. One is this ultra reliable low latency communication that is intended to be used in factory automation or any critical communications. Another one then is this massive IoT, where we have zillions of devices transmitting very low amounts of data, very seldom, but still the sheer number of those gives some requirements for the network, and it's quite obvious that not all self-declared SCPs apply to all devices that comply with the standard, or at least comply with a part of the standard, and that's going to be one additional complication in this 5G licensing scheme, that it's going to be quite difficult to find the actual shares of declared SCPs in particular device segments. With this massive IoT, some possible licensees could be, I don't know, even like cities that develop smart city concept, where they have a great number of all kind of sensors that are connected through cellular connectivity to some sort of intelligence in the network. It can be like a public sector that is going to be a licensing customer in these cases. Can be anything else as well.
Yeah, so this is where I think it gets really interesting. So we quite often we treat transportation as a sort of microcosm for this, and I think we're going to do that later on as well. But when we think about the transportation sector, obviously we have car manufacturers, but then we also have the civil engineering sector in terms of highways infrastructure and bridges. We have as you said, Mika, the sort of metropolitan agencies, the highways agency in various places that will be involved in deploying mobile technology in a broad sense in terms of many devices, but maybe not using all of the 5G standards. I mean, the way I kind of think of it is that a sensor in a bridge doesn't need to be able to download the whole of the latest James Bond movie in 20 seconds. It needs to transmit very infrequently. And I think that gets us onto our next topic, and this is something that you alluded to, Paul, earlier on, which is around the business model. You gave us an overview of the business model in terms of previous generations of mobile licensing. I think it's clear that things are going to change. But what are we going to see first? And transportation maybe is one of those, but what's really going to need to be taken into account by the licensors? They do this already, but are they going to need more evolved business models in terms of engaging with these new licensees?
Thanks very much, Ed. Yes, I believe so. I think the point that was just made is right on the money in terms of previous generations of the standard and the products that have been in the market. Treat the standard in a very monolithic way. You implement most, if not all, of the standard on most of the products that are licensed. And then you have the first degree of complexity arising from the fact that people will need parts of the standard. They won't need access to all of the patents. And then I think the most substantial change that the licensing practice is going to have to adapt to is with widespread adoption of 5G by all of the entities that have been mentioned on this presentation already. The sheer transaction costs of licensing on the existing model are going to become prohibitive. If I am, as a patent holder, looking to license to companies who make low-cost, low-margin product, and there are many hundreds of them, to be able to go and individually sit down with each in turn and explain the basis of their infringement through my claim charts, and then enter in an 18 to 24-month negotiation with each, is going to be so much more expensive than a realistic return from that effort. And from licensees that are focused on getting product into the market quickly, there cannot be enough industry experts to consider the essentiality of each and every patent put in front of each and every company, distributed across all of those companies. So I think we'll see an increase in licensors because of new technology coming in, just as we have done with previous generations. And with the widespread adoption of the standard and many more licensees in the market, we have a major structural systemic problem with the transaction costs that are going to arise from that situation, because it's just too expensive to do it on this model.
Right, that is particularly interesting, and I really do take your point about the number of experts that are available in the industry. As a service provider ourselves at Derwent, we do some of this work, and our team is big, but it's not that big, and you can really feel that. Mika, coming to you on this, your experiences at Nokia, and I don't mean you to divulge anything that you wouldn't want divulged, but what are you seeing in terms of your approach to the licensing market for these new licensees? What are you needing to take into account that maybe you didn't need to do before?
Well, I don't know if we need to take into account anything that we didn't take into account before, but we need to take into account in more cases and in different businesses. Obviously, what we do analysis on patent infringement, and when we find a business that uses our patents, we contact them. But in 5G, we probably need to look at different types of businesses that use cellular connectivity in their business model, and then contact them. And as Paul said, it's probably going to be so distributed business or fragmented business that it's going to be difficult to, contact all the players that we believe use our patents. So for that, we need to find another way than personal contact by letter or that kind of approach.
Right. I mean, hearing both of you speak, we introduced the whole concept of standard essentiality and standard essential patent, or SEP, licensing earlier on. But to my ear, it sounds a little bit like this is like licensing in more consumer electronics generally, more ad hoc, non-standard essential licensing. I mean, Paul, is it going to be? Are there going to be occasions, or is there going to be a lot of that type of model involved in 5G?
I think the thing that does introduce that aspect of it into 5G is not necessarily everybody will want to implement all of the standard and therefore need access to all of the patents. So that is much more like traditional patent license, where you're looking at an individual product company and having the discussion with them about what of your patents they are infringing, and then having a commercial discussion over licensing rates. And that is a significant change from the model that's gone before. I think the other thing that changes in this context is around the life cycle of products. So much of the licensing model that we have is on the basis that smartphones are being renewed every year to 2 years. People are doing licensing deals for 5 to 7 years. But what are we going to do now when we're going to be talking about the type of products that are going to be in transportation infrastructure? They're going to be there for decades. They're not being renewed. They're not being updated. That's a function of consumer choice and consumer preference. When we look at industrial applications, it's not done on fashion or notoriety or the desire to have the latest brand. It's much more about a core sale of core functionality. So you do see these different things, the need to access different patents, but also the longevity of the devices after that sale, when you have a licensing model that's very much driven on a percentage of new sales.
Right. So there's sort of pushes and pulls on the business model, and I guess the price of the license in terms of cycle time may be less, so therefore there's less revenue for the licensee that they're bringing in off the back of access to that license. But at the same time, there's potentially more devices out there, right? So it's an interesting piece, and I think that this portion of the discussion of access to any portions being slightly Wild West, I think takes us into our next topic, which is, do we need to talk about patent pools? And when I was introduced to patent pools, I kind of felt it theoretically what it was, but not really practically what it was. So we're about to introduce a new idea for our audience here, Paul. So before we get into the pros and cons of patent pools in terms of a 5G piece, can you just give us a quick sort of 1 minute primer on what a patent pool is in mobile licensing?
Yes, I'm happy to do that. I'm not advocating patent pools one way or another. The basic structure by which they operate is a group of licensors will come together. They will make their patents available through a single transaction. So a licensee can approach the patent pool and gain access to the patents of a large number of licensors without the complexity of a multitude of transactions with each of them, and usually with a reasonable degree of price certainty as they approach the pool. Another key function that's often associated with pools, which is very relevant to the discussion we're having here, is many pools undertake to assess patents that go into the pool for essentiality. So that cost that implementers have today of trying to find some way to know whether what the licensor is offering them is something they actually need or not can be borne by the patent pool, and those costs are then aggregated across all of the licensees and all of the licensors in that pool.
So it sounds, on the face of it, and I think we're going to get into this, but on the face of it, it sounds perfect. It sounds like a shop front, right? It's a shop for licenses. Mika, is it as simple as that? How applicable are patent pools in 5G? Is it more useful? Is it particularly critical? Or is it less useful?
Well, it can be useful or less useful. It depends how large share of licensors are going to join that patent pool.
Right.
Problem with patent pools is typically is that they don't represent all the required SCPs to comply with the standard. So, like currently, if I recall correctly, Avanci is now establishing a patent pool, or has established a patent pool that Nokia has also joined, and that patent pool is licensing cellular SCPs for various industries, automotives being one of them, and it represents roughly 50% of the total SCP population. So, in a sense, you get half of the patents you need, or license to half of the patents you need from that patent pool. But then again, for the rest, you need to negotiate bilaterally with the patent holders. So.
Right. So it doesn't.
So far, I think MPEG LA patent pool has been the most successful patent pool in the history, and even that didn't license all the video coding SCPs that was required.
Yeah, it's a good example, right? So yes, it's a shop, but it's not a shop that sells everything. And Paul, your thoughts? I mean, you alluded to it at the beginning of this section that you weren't necessarily an advocate of. What's your view? Are there downsides here to pooling?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, Mika hit the key point on the head, which is it depends on critical mass. If you cannot get the majority of the licensors to the patent pool, then the benefits of the pool are greatly diluted very quickly. And if you look at MPEG LA, great example by Mika of what has proved successful, but you look at in video codecs now at the HEVC situation, there are at least 3 pools for the same area. So it doesn't always work in the way that you would expect it to, even when you're staying in the same technology space. But if you can get critical mass in the pool, most businesses, most implementers, they're looking for certainty. And if the pool can put on a price on what the majority of my IP costs are going to be, then I have some certainty around which to make investment decisions and to look at my overall bill of materials and my products without the risk that there is a population of, I'm trying to drive down the risk that there is a population of patents out there that I'm not aware of that someone's going to come calling and ask me to license. So whether it's a pool or whether it's other forms of aggregation, they can all drive efficiency, but you have to align incentives to the point where it's not just beneficial for the licensee who's benefiting from that essentiality check, who's benefiting from the fact they only have to go to potentially one place or far fewer places. It has to be economically advantageous to the licensors, and maybe in 5G, because of the greatly increased number of transactions for those licensors, it may become so.
Okay. Another thing that strikes me as we're going through this is that this for a beginner in telecommunications licensing. So if you're an aerospace company or a civil engineering firm or a measurement and test firm, instrumentation firm, this feels very difficult and dicey. And I think you went to the heart of it, Paul, in terms of have I got any certainty around what my costs are? And what I'd like to get from both of you, and Paul, I'll start with you. What kind of homework can these firms be doing? What should they be doing even? How aware are they even of it, the fact that it's coming?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge for new entrants in product markets that are going to use SEPs is they build their product and the first company turns up and they tell them that they have a SEP portfolio and they need to take a license. And the first question is, how many more of you guys are lined up behind this guy? and you face that challenge. I think the best piece of homework to do is to make sure that companies understand what actually goes into their products. When the product managers in that company are making the decisions of what features to implement, a reasonable estimate of IP cost should be part of that product planning process. It's just another cost on the BOM. You need to understand what you are committing your company to when you decide it would be great to have the following feature, which makes use of a standardized technology. And I think that proper consideration of the IP costs before features are added to product is probably the most important piece of homework. And adding new features to product with your eyes wide open. That's the homework that's needed.
Right, and you know what we're talking about here, and Mika, I'd like to come to you and get your views as well on this from the perspective of an infrastructure company. What we're talking about here is if you're somebody developing and innovating a widget in the agriculture space or the automated manufacture space, and you go let's use these new 5G networks that are out there in order to do something really useful for us in terms of data supply or data communication. What you just did was you piggybacked on all of the development and research and very expensive development that companies like Nokia and Ericsson and Qualcomm and everybody else have put into developing these technologies in the first place. That's where the fairness of the license probably comes in that you need to pay for access to that. But what are you seeing from Nokia's perspective, Mika? Are you finding these new licensees need to do more homework?
Well, first of all, if Nokia contacts someone because they have a lucrative business that is based on cellular connectivity, I would say that it is a happy problem for them because they have generated a lucrative business.
Right.
And then we just need to find a reasonable royalty on front terms.
Right. I mean, is it? Are you finding you're having to do anything differently? Is there, and one of the things that we thought about when we were doing this webinar is that there is a sort of public service education component to this. Are you finding that you're having to educate these new licensees in everything that we've been talking about so far today?
Yes, typically very much so. So basically, all the license negotiations start with painting the picture of telecommunication standards and the traditional licensing on those and how they fit into that picture. And once that is done, we typically introduce a number of our patents that we know they are using and so establish that they require a license. And after that, it's only about money.
It's only about money, right? Which sounds like the easiest piece here, depending on your perspective, right? I think
you have to remember that I'm a technical guy, so.
Fair enough, Mika. So, as we get into sort of the last piece of this, there's quite a lot of change going on, literally as we speak. When we, Paul, you mentioned it earlier, where we see Intel exiting its 5G modem business, and Apple is now in the process of potentially picking that up. It's not completed yet, but what it alludes to is that we're used to in 3G, 4G, GSM, we're used to a world of here's the handset manufacturers, here's the service providers, here's the infrastructure companies, here's the chipset companies. Paul, it's obviously changing. Is there more change to come? Are we seeing, obviously with Apple and Intel, we're seeing a muddying of those buckets of players in mobile comm space? Is there more of that to come? Should we expect more?
I'm not sure that is a muddying. I think that may well be more of the same. We've seen very significant portfolios change hands. We've seen holders of large set patent portfolios sell the sections of their portfolio to practicing and non-practicing entities in the market. As we have more new entrants into the market who are the potential licensees who will want to be in a position to be able to cross-license, that's going to drive transactions. People, when they're sitting down with patent holders and settling on an agreed rate, if they have the financial resources, they're going to want to buy so that the next person through the door, they have something they can cross-license. So I think that we will see those portfolios moving around. We will inevitably continue to see consolidation. When companies consolidate, they may find they have more patents than they need for the purposes of their business, and they will transact. So I think it's just realistic to see consolidation and some companies exiting the business. And I think it's realistic that there is a drive for demand of acquiring assets from those new entrant companies who are looking at their licensing costs and wondering how they can best manage them.
And I think, Mika, have you got any thoughts on that?
I agree with Paul that it's very fluid situation and constantly evolving. Patent holders will be different and patent portfolios will change hands. There will be some transactions. Likewise, there will be new manufacturers and new suppliers for those. So impossible to tell what happens.
Okay, no, that's fair, and that takes me to my last two questions for you. That there's unknowns out there. There's things still to come. There's ambiguity still to come. My question to you, my first wrap-up question. I've got another one as well. But my first wrap-up question is, what don't you know yet? What are you waiting to see the outcome of? What are you waiting to evolve that's going to be changing things for you? I'll start with you, Mika.
I'm not sure I fully understand the question.
I guess the question is it's a tough one, right? Because I'm asking you for an unknown. But what do you think is still the largest unknown in terms of the deployment of 5G, in terms of licensing, or the market for
5G? I guess it's going to be the deployment.
Right.
in the sense that we know roughly we know exactly what the smartphone market currently is, and 5G probably will increase that a little bit. But then again, cellular networks have not been traditionally used for factory automation or any that kind of applications, and it will be seen to what extent they will be used and in what manner. Similarly, this Internet of Things, whether each and every sensor will have cellular connectivity, or whether there is some sort of near field radio interface that is used to connect to hub that then can be connected to network by wireless LAN or whatever alternative technology. That's also unknown. So we don't really know whether 5G in these other areas will be successful. But if it will be, then we are happy to license.
Okay, great message. And Paul, what about you? What don't you know yet that you're waiting to find out?
We don't know about the adoption of 5G. As someone who once spent 2 years of his career developing a standard which had ready customers waiting in North America to buy it, which was never deployed after 2 years of standardization, we shouldn't make any assumptions that all standards will necessarily be commercially successful. And the thing that's going to drive that is the biggest thing that we don't know yet. Who's going to make the great products? We know smartphones. We've seen smartphones. For 5G, we're looking for something different. We're looking for new product classes coming into the market that we haven't seen before. So who is going to drive the consumer demand for those great products that we haven't yet imagined?
I think that's a great starting point to our wrap up. And I apologize to both of you for the slight on the fly nature of this question. As we look to the future and we look at the Internet of Things, the potential for millions, I think the word you used, Mika, was billions of connected devices. Do you have a favorite? Is there an industry or a use or even a small application out there, even if it's really niche, that excites you, that you think is particularly intriguing in terms of influence in mass mobile connectivity? And Mika, I'll come to you first. Do you have a favorite?
Well, this summer, these electric scooters were introduced in the city I live in, Finland, and they have obviously GPS chip and cellular connectivity that allows the company that maintains them to collect the ones that when the battery has run empty. So I don't know, for devices that are movable and can be rented to consumers. That might be one killer application for this kind of.
I like that one. Paul, do you have a favorite?
Probably a few. I think if we look at the biggest changes that are happening right now, there's been a fundamental shift in people's understanding of the environment. Right now in central London, we have people blocking our roads, so
yes,
you can't actually get down the Strand at the moment because people are taking to the streets. We have much greater awareness from people around schools, around air quality, and issues like that. So I think in the field of environmental monitoring, there is a significantly increased demand for information. We have a technology here which is being optimized for the deployment of many, many sensors and the provision of exactly the type of information that people are now demanding from their public authorities about the quality of the air they breathe, the damage that certain things do to the environment, the things that help the environment. And in an age of big data, being able to collect information on that scale, I think probably environmental monitoring offers one of the more interesting applications of this.
And I think that's a really quite nice, both of you had quite sort of optimistic and really nice way of wrapping up the discussion portion of our webinar today. So that wraps up the piece from our panelists, Mika and Paul. Thank you for all of your thoughts and knowledge that you've put to this. Now we pass the ball to you, our audience, for your questions. Again, as Brian mentioned at the beginning of the call, if you have a question for our panel today, please type it into the chat or Q&A box in the WebEx panel. As we said before, if we don't get to your question, we will follow up with you. So I'm going to look now to the panel, and I'm going to pick up our first question for you, Mika and Paul. So here we go. What do you think in the 5G licensing regime will be the basis for the royalty calculation? So this goes to our point about business model. Will it be the smallest selling patent practicing unit, or SSPPU, or will it still be based on the price of the downstream product, in brackets mobile phone? Paul, I'll put that one to you.
I think that goes to the issue of complexity and licensing. So if we're looking at a situation where people are going to implement fractional parts of a standard, we've already added a degree of complexity. The great advantage to licensing at the OEM level is that product contains all of the patents, and the further downstream that you license, the opportunity to minimize the number of transactions that comes from that takes away a lot of this transaction costs. If licensors have to face companies that some of their suppliers have picked up a license along the way and others haven't, there is a lot of additional cost that comes with that approach. And I think the other major challenge with this argument is there's clearly been a lot of disagreement in the industry about what the basis for calculating royalty rate should be. And that debate has now become so polarized that it's very, very hard to find a constructive way through with it because people have become very entrenched in their views.
Right.
But I think if we look at things from the point of view is ultimately, there is a number that someone in the supply chain is going to pay for the access to those technologies. Let's try and build a model about transaction efficiency and try not to get religious about where in the supply chain it has to be licensed.
Right, because those business models, whether it's agriculture or automotive or whatever it is, those business models need to make sense to those providers anyway, and someone somewhere will negotiate a rate with someone that enables that to work, right? Is that what,
yes,
is that
indeed.
what you mean?
Yeah, and if I, as a licensor, am licensing an OEM who's putting the final product on the market, I know that I'm doing one transaction for all the patents that I own that are infringed in that product. If I am having to deal with a situation where I'm licensed to many suppliers into the builder of to the person that produces that product, then when I look at that final product, how many of my patents have been exhausted, how many haven't been exhausted, I'm adding complexity into that licensing model when it's already complex. So I think it's a big challenge if people start to insist that patents are licensed earlier in the supply chain, because it becomes much more of a challenge for licensees to know that they've actually taken care of all the licensing, inbound licensing that they need to do, and it's more complex for the licensor to be able to look at a product and price a patent license fairly, knowing that different suppliers have picked up patent licenses along the way and integrated them.
Makes sense. Mika, have you got anything to add on that question? Royalty calculation?
No, I totally agree with what Paul said just about it, and
okay.
I agree also that we probably never get a consensus what should be the basis for royalty calculation. There may be a court decision in the future that sets some sort of standard for that.
Okay. So to our question putter, it depends, and it's complicated, and it goes straight to the heart of this, and watch this space as it evolves. Moving on, we've had a whole bunch of questions around patent pools. And I think all of us, when we were putting this session together, were fairly aware that patent pooling is one of the more controversial aspects of this particular discussion when it comes to 5G licensing. The first one I think we can handle quite quickly. Paul, I'm going to put this to you. Are patent pools currently used in 3G, 4G, UMTS patents, and may they be used for 5G patents? Are patent pools anyway, sorry, bear with me, anyway used in mobile phones telecommunications? I think the answer to that's a simple yes.
It is a simple yes. Yes, there are patent pools that exist in the 3G field, in the 4G field, and there are patent pools that exist for other technologies that are going into telecommunications products like video codecs.
Perfect. Okay. Mika, I think this is one that speaks directly to the type of work that you're doing on a regular basis with your team. Can you provide suggestions on how to figure out which patents are tied to which features? How do you
yes, I think you better ask the licensor.
Is that right?
That's the easiest way to find out.
They will tell you.
No, well, not only will they tell you, they should tell you. I don't think it is reasonable for a licensor to say, yes, okay, this is in the standard, but I'm not going to tell you which part of the standard or which feature that you're using in your product. I mean, I think that's part of the onus is on the patent holder to explain, first of all, why their patent is essential, and in the course of doing so, explain what feature.
Perfect. So right into the
if you start to do it yourself by reading these 20,000 declarations or declared SCP families, it's going to be a long day.
Got it. So again, to our question putter, this work's probably already been done. So lean on the work that's already been done. The next question, again around patent pools, is should the adhesion to a pool be a condition to be reorganized as a standard essential patent like the commitment to FRAND? Don't you think that firms will require that licensors put them in order to provide accessible, understandable, transparent, and secure licensing process? And that sounds like it's a slightly different, it's a different question, but I think it might be, Mika, I think it might be similar to the question before, that if you're in a pool, you have to put the information out there.
Yes. If you are in a pool, you need to convince the pool that the patents you submit there are SCPs. Yep. But then again, I don't understand what does the person mean with put them in order to provide accessible, understandable, transparent, and secure licensing process. I mean, this licensing process goes according to the pool rules, and those may differ from pool to pool.
Got it. Okay. Well, I'll move on to the next one. Again, this is around the business model. And Paul, I might start with you with this one. Can 5G licensing be categorized into tiers, with basic functionality being in a lower tier, with more specialized functionality being in other tiers? Is there any work by the 5G standards body in identifying such tiers?
In terms of whether there has been work done, I do not know the answer to that question. In terms of the principle of actually deciding some form of profile, that works well for technology standards in terms of interoperability, as particularly when highly complex new standards are introduced, they're often introduced in phases, which ensure that everyone that needs to connect that's operating on the same phase continues to be able to interwork with each other and to interoperate. And exactly the same approach makes sense in patent licensing. You know, if you can have classes of devices, we've seen some of this in different classes of devices in earlier generations of the standard, where we've had data-only devices. We've had profiles of LTE tailored for specific markets, like the machine-to-machine market. So I think, yes, it's reasonable to be able to form some tiers so that people that need access to certain types of patents, but not others. Ed, your example of the sensor under the bridge that does not necessarily need to download the James Bond movie is a good one. You know, if that means that certain technologies are not needed on that device and it can be set in a different profile, then that's a perfectly reasonable way to structure this and introduce some simplicity.
And Mika, your thoughts? Would you agree with that?
Yes, I agree.
Okay, perfect. And we're just coming up to the top of the hour now in terms of the session. So we have a technical question, which is always a fun one. I know most of us are technologists at heart, or at least in the beginning. I would like to know, the question is, I would like to know how 5G stands up in different weather conditions, mainly the rainy season, compared to 4G, 3G, 2G. And Mika, I'll put that one to you first with your technical hat on.
Well, 5G is partly 4G, so 4G is a fundamental part of 5G, so it stands equally as 4G.
Got it. Paul, anything to add on that?
I think with my radio communications engineer hats on, I'll say it depends which frequency band you're in, and I think I think more generally we'll just say the sun is bound to be shining with 5G.
The sun is bound to be shining in 5G. So that's a good place, I think, to wrap up. That's pretty much all we have time for today. I want to give a very big thank you to both of you, Mika and Paul, for lending us your brains for 60 minutes. From all of our attendees, it's been a really great session to get your thinking on this. A very big thank you to all of our audience, all of our attendees for joining us today. As you exit the WebEx, as Brian mentioned at the top of the call, a brief survey will appear onto your browser. If you get a chance, please take a few minutes to complete that survey. We love hearing your feedback on our sessions, and we've had a really good time over the last 3 months working on 5G as a topic, so your interest is very much appreciated. So thank you again, Mika and Paul, and thank you for coming today, everybody. Thank you.